We're just turning to another issue that will also have big reverberations in the election, but of course is having big reverberations in the world. And that is the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war, where hasn't been going great for Ukraine in the past couple weeks, the past week or so. But there's a lot of issues hanging around all of this and geopolitics. And for all of that and to cut through all of the fog here, we are very honored to be joined once again by Mazda Majidi, who is an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Mazda, as always, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hi, Eugene. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. And let me just start with maybe the sit rep, if you can abide my military terminology here, as it concerns Russia and Ukraine, because there's been this new Russian offensive that's making a lot of news. So if you could just maybe speak to sort of the context of that here to start.
Sure. It's referred to as a surprise offensive. Russia has been making significant advances in the province of Kharkiv towards the city of Kharkiv, which is the biggest city in that province. Ukraine has gone in a state of crisis. President Zelensky canceled his trip that was scheduled to go to Spain and Portugal. The foreign minister has announced that all foreign events are postponed for now. Zelensky is in a hospital in Kharkiv talking to people, but also for those of us who follow the news of this war, we know that it's usually it's very exaggerated in the sense that gains that the Ukrainians make are very much shown to be much bigger than they are, to the point that sometimes you wonder if Russia is going to run out of soldiers the way that the media covers it. But despite that, right now, it is very clear, and it seems like the corporate media are acknowledging how this is a bad situation for Ukraine. Interestingly, Ukraine itself their military spokespeople, they have a term when they have to retreat on the front, and the term that they use is that we moved our troops to a more advantageous position. And they've definitely used that terminology, the moving of the troops to a more advantageous position repeatedly. One particular fear that Ukraine has, and Zelensky has mentioned this, is not just the real possibility that Russia will take Kharkiv, but also the fact that Ukraine will have to reinforce its military in the Kharkiv region, which will make it potentially much easier, and that might be part of Russia's plan to then make an attack towards the Donbass region, which is the area where there's a large Russian population, and it has long been thought that's one of the major objectives of the Russians. So all in all, it's going pretty badly for the Ukrainians, and this is something, alarm bells are going off in the West.
Is that why Antony Blinken had to do a musical performance to distract us? I mean, it's actually pretty wild. It does seem like a bit of theatrics to get some attention away from what's happening on the battlefield. But also another story present in the news at the moment is that China, the Russia, like Putin and Xi, have talked about or discussed some sort of Chinese peace plan. So I'm curious, how relevant is that at this point? Because the U.S. still seems to be quite committed to continuing to supply billions and billions of dollars in weapons to the Ukrainians. And until that stops, I mean, the Ukrainians can continue shooting at the Russians. So until that weapons faucet, until that comes to an end, I think you're going to see this war continue to play out no matter how poorly the Ukrainians are performing, no?
Right. Well, first, let me reference, Rania, you mentioned the mini rock concert that Blinken did. For those who may not be familiar, I believe it was last night or the night before, he is on a surprise visit to Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. Oh, okay. And that's
there he
him.
is. There he is.
So he goes into this bar and I guess deploys his displays his artistic talents and so forth. Actually, that raised a lot of eyebrows in Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians in support of the war effort were saying that this is insulting to the soldiers losing their lives at the front. I want to add that it's very interesting because the points that he made, we understand how difficult it is and we're with you. But the basic line that he used, which is a propaganda line that the West has used forever, is that Ukraine, you're not just fighting for Ukraine, you're fighting for democracy, for freedom, for the whole world, and so forth. And it's very telling. Of course, not the supporters of the genocide in Palestine are not representatives of freedom and democracy and so forth. But it is true that Ukraine and the people who are losing their lives in this war are very much being used as cannon fodder. The deal is we give you the supplies, we give you the weapons, and you go out there and fight Russia. One of the things that has happened as a result, and this is why it's very significant, is that, and if we have time, we can talk about the various factors leading to the advance of the Russian forces, but morale among the Ukrainian fighters is low, and it has gone down significantly since the beginning of the war, even since compared to 6 months ago. But on Putin's trip to China, very interesting because China in different regions of the world has acted as a mediator. Of course, the U.S. Takes serious issue with that. Similarly, right now, the U.S. is kind of mocking the effort of China in, bringing about some sort of mediation. China, about a year ago, put out like a 10-point plan, which was very reasonable. And of course, it was completely rejected by the U.S. and Western Europeans and Zelensky and everybody. Zelensky, on the other hand, his conditions for peace are like ridiculously aggressive. Not only should Russia pull out and pay reparations, but they should give up on the Crimea and accept fault and so forth. So it hasn't been a serious effort on the part of Ukraine to engage in any sort of talks about potential peace. But of course, one of the possibilities is that now that Russia is in a much stronger position than it has been in quite some time, that may change the equation. Maybe Zelensky will show some interest in peace talks. Maybe even the US or other Western European countries will be interested in that. But that's something that hasn't been the case before, therefore no meaningful peace talks so far.
Well, on the issue of some of the things that's helping Russia move forward, seemingly apace here against Ukraine, seems to be this issue that's becoming very controversial in Ukraine, which is the number of soldiers that are available to fight. There's all these videos now coming out on social media of like bars and clubs being raided, people being taken in, people Googling how to swim across rivers to escape. So it seems like that is a big variable here, Mazda, and how the war goes, is that it seems like Ukraine's having some serious manpower issues.
That's very true. I mean, when we hear about the things that are leading up to Russian advances, we often hear about the mismatch between artillery shells ratio of anywhere from 3-1 or 10-1 advantage Russia. And of course, the delay that happened in the US in giving virtually unlimited amount of funds in the billions, $61 billion this time, has had a significant impact. But the other thing, as you say, Eugene, and this is very significant, is that, I mean, in the initial months of the war, it didn't seem like Ukraine had that much of a problem recruiting people. There were volunteers, there were athletes and boxers and, all kinds of celebrities, either for real or at least for show, participating in the war effort. But that has changed. The casualties have gone up. The war has gone on longer. And I want to say to a number of people, possibly within Ukraine, it has become more obvious than before that, they're being forced to be cannon fodder for, other forces. I know when in the US, you often hear the term proxy war when you're talking about liberation movements and um, revolutionary solidarity and support. But this is certainly to the extent that Ukraine is engaged in it. It's a proxy war on the part of NATO because the very root cause of the war was the insistence of the West, of NATO countries, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, to continue circling the Russian Federation with NATO powers. As many as 14 formerly Eastern European countries have been recruited into NATO. And of course, Russia could absolutely not afford to have Ukraine become part of NATO and install advanced missiles and other things. So, the Ukrainian young men in particular who are being asked to go give their lives, far fewer of them are willing to do so now.
Mazda, I'm curious, one thing that's really malicious, nefarious about the US effort throughout this war is they know that ultimately the Russians are superior militarily. I mean, maybe a lot of you as politicians are too dumb to know because, they just get their talking points delivered to them by whoever pays them the most. But for the most part, I mean, when it comes to those who recognize and understand how militaries work and what it would actually take for Ukraine to win, they recognize that ultimately there's no win for Ukraine here. And the longer this goes on, it really is just unnecessary bloodshed, all for the sake of trying to make Russia weaker. So I guess my question for you is, and I know we can't say for certainty, and make big predictions because it could turn out to be wrong. But ultimately, it's very unlikely, I would say, that Ukraine would be able to defeat Russia. So it's just postponing the inevitable, isn't it?
Yes, I agree, Rania. But one of the things, especially this has come out in the last week or so, is that the right wing of the ruling establishments in the US and in Europe are saying, look, Putin is winning. This is dangerous. And we know once he takes Ukraine, he'll move on to Western Europe. All this fantasy stuff that's not real. But the notion that if Russia wins, if Putin wins, and we know what a monster he is, according to decades of a demonization campaign, that once he takes Ukraine, he'll move on to Western Europe. So if you don't stop him in Ukraine, you'll have to stop him further west in the midst of our real democracies, so to speak. And I think right now they're pushing for troops on the ground. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's certainly hope among the more militaristic, adventurous sectors of the ruling class in Western Europe and the US to use the relative weakness of Ukraine and the likelihood of victories by Russia to put troops on the ground. And that's the thing. I know since it's been a couple of years, it's been in the background. It hasn't been headline news, but I remember, and I know you guys remember too, when this happened, it was seen as a major escalation, a major danger that could potentially bring the world to another world war. And while it's been in the background, right now, the advances that Russia is making is dangerous in that way as well. I'm not saying it is going to happen, but I wouldn't rule it out as impossible for some, special forces from the US or other European countries to be sent into the region. Ukraine is essentially fighting the whole thing using US weapons and funding. And of course, it wouldn't be a stretch to have special forces there, which would be a major escalation and a danger considering both sides being the US and NATO, Russia and NATO having nuclear weapons. So it's a very dangerous situation. But the short answer to your question or comment, Rania, is I don't think there's a high likelihood that Ukraine can be victorious. It has maybe the fifth of the population of Russia. If it weren't for virtually unlimited military supplies and funding, this wouldn't have lasted more than weeks or months.
No, I think it's a very, very, very relevant piece here, and Yeah, it just feel like you're living through the looking glass on some of this when you read this. But as always, we really appreciate you, Mazda, being able to join and help us cut through all the BS, if you will, on a lot of these different pieces. Mazda Majidi of the Answer Coalition, thanks so much for giving us some of your time
Thank you very
here on the
much.
Freedom Side.
I appreciate it.